So the Jeremy Kyle Show has been taken off our TV screens for good. But why? What really went wrong for the star and his show? And why shouldn't we pity the guests? Consider subscribing by the end of the video. When you think of the Jeremy Kyle Show, most of us who have only occasionally watched it on a sick day think of gnarly toothed chavs shouting at each other over who had sex with who. The show got taken down as a result of stirring up people's untenable personal situations for the sake of entertainment, which itself eventually became so mentally traumatizing for one person they committed suicide. I agree that no TV show should exploit the misfortunes of another just for entertainment, without also helping them. But the show also tried to help people. But it also became to be associated with a direct attack on the working classes. This is the association I have the most trouble with. Firstly, it talked about serious personal life-changing issues like rape, drug use, adultery, rights to children and DNA tests. What went wrong in this regard was that it tried to solve such conflicts by creating heated arguments on a stage in front of an audience. Inevitably, such issues led to walkouts, bust-ups and tears, all of which proved to be a ratings hit. But because it mostly got low-income or non-working individuals on its show, it inevitably led to an association with the working classes to these issues. But they are not solely working class issues, and anyone can suffer the same life-changing personal events that I just mentioned. In the show, most scenarios would play out in a very simple and tired format. We would meet the individual who was part of the story presented to us as the victim. Then we would meet any associates of the victim. Then the villain would turn up to a series of boos. Then there would be a series of heated arguments and beratement until we either found out that the victim turns out to be the villain or that justice is served towards the original villain. When the show was taken off air, people made the assumption that because it featured working class people and because they were berated for entertainment, they were all somehow victims who deserved pity. This is not true. While the people on the show were of a working class, low IQ nature, it didn't mean that everyone on it deserved ill treatment. In fact, the show's biggest strength was the way it could barbarically treat potential adulterers, rapists, domestic abusers, paedophiles and even murderers in a way that harks back to medieval times. It was in that inbuilt sense of satisfaction served from revenge that the show stayed so long. But it exploited people too dumb, too lazy, too bored and too desperate who felt the only way to solve their grievance was by airing it on TV, thus presenting the image that working class people have nothing better to do than argue and have sex. Because of the way it forced its audience to recognise the stereotypes as quickly as possible, making villains and victims of the people on the stage to be able to tell the story as easily as possible, it created victims and villains out of people who weren't mentally ready to be victims and villains. And because it was on TV and recorded, it permanently branded them that way. But we can learn a lesson as a society from the way we deal with these scandals. Just because a guest on the Jeremy Kyle Show commits suicide doesn't mean all guests on the show were victims. In fact, it does the opposite of equality by pitying those of lower classes, like the people who appeared on the show. It really has nothing to do with class. Rape, adultery, drug use are just as likely to be undertaken by the upper classes as they are anyone else. Just because you don't hear of it as much doesn't mean it doesn't happen. The game of association is completely irrelevant. I can just as easily associate the name Jeremy with the same pitying disdain as the Jeremy Kyle Show does with the working classes by saying people like Paxman, Vine, Hunt, Corbyn, Clarkson, Kyle are all Marmite type people, therefore people named Jeremy shouldn't be allowed on TV. To draw such swooping, irrelevant associations puts a massive roadblock in the way of free speech and actually only discriminates further against the community you're trying to protect by excluding them from having a voice on TV. The same could be said for other scandals this week. For example, the way James Charles was outed as trying to turn straight people gay. While this is wrong on a predatory sexual level, in that a grown man was trying to force people into sex against consent, it really has nothing to do with sexuality. In fact, by associating it with sexuality, it makes the assumption that straight people are victims and gay people are sexual predators, once again doing the opposite for equality. Danny Baker posted a photo of a chimpanzee, captioning it as the royal baby. While it's harder to defend this association, I believe the tweet to be disgustingly racist. However, the tweet itself never really explicitly mentions race. It's natural to have compassion for a baby and therefore villainize the author of the tweet, but by associating it with race, it only perpetuates the association that black people and monkeys are one of the same thing, and therefore by raising the race issue, sometimes it can only anger those who don't see anything wrong with the tweet and are willing to defend it, creating the opposite effect of what you're trying to protect. Sometimes censoring an argument to protect a vulnerable community, such as a 2-day-old black child, can only cause a backlash to the censoring, whereby people do the opposite. Now, a 2-day-old innocent black child is 99.9% going to be defended, but a grown, drug-abusing, cheating, abusive, violent, working-class man? Eventually, backlash against censorship feeds a narrative that causes distrust. In other words, when associating with the minority communities like class, race, sexuality, disability, age, gender, one has to be super careful these days. On the one hand, you don't want to victimize all the villains. On the other hand, you don't want to villainize all the victims. The mob decides who the villains and the victims of society are, and TV producers and politicians are only going to carry on exploiting that for financial and political gain, while at the same time protecting themselves. This is why we should either criticize everyone or protect everyone. But pitying some and berating others is only going to lead to unfair treatment, especially when that is broadcast. But do you agree with me? Join in the debate below and subscribe.